Welcome, friends, to Dharma for Doctors, Spiritual Care for Caregivers. Where's the fire? You tell me. This episode is all about when to call a chaplain. I'm your host, Chaplain Greg Holden, and I'm with Daly, the firehouse dog. How do you like this thing? Forget about it. If you're in a hospital, you've got chaplains you can call on. Have you ever called them? Does anyone tell you when to do that? In a nursing home, there might be a chaplain on staff, or sometimes chaplains come in from hospices or palliative care companies to patients who are on their service. When do you, the staff person, ask the chaplain to see someone? If you're a caregiver for someone on hospice or palliative care, you can call the service and ask the chaplain to come by. Did you know that? The question is when. The firefighter's hat ought to give you a clue. Chaplains, like firefighters and police, run toward trouble, usually when everyone else is running the other way. If you've got emotional or spiritual trouble you can't handle, or a fire that needs to be put out, call a chaplain. Once I was just hanging out in the ICU. For anyone out there who's a young chaplain student, it's not a bad idea to just hang around the ICU from time to time, so people get to know you. I always found it more interesting than sitting in the office anyway. Once when I just started in the hospital, I was hanging out in the ICU when I heard the attending physician say, "Can you call the chaplain for that lady?" I went up to him and introduced myself. "I'm the chaplain, how can I help?" Turned out a man had just died and his wife was very upset. There was shock and grief and some anger around the treatment he had received. Either what had been done or that more could not be done. I can't remember. She had just given the attending a real earful. There she was standing next to her husband's body, crying. I went in to see her, and I listened to what was going on, and we said a prayer together. This soothed her as much as possible at that very difficult moment. That doctor knew when to call the chaplain. Here are some other reasons. When there is fighting or arguing. Any doctors and nurses out there know this happens, right? The room of a seriously ill or dying patient is not necessarily a calm and peaceful place. There can be resentment. There can be jealousy. Why is so-and-so the power of attorney for health care and not me? Why am I not on that form? Why aren't we giving more medicines? Mom liked you best. Could be anything. This is another example of the chaplain running toward the fire and trying to put it out. Once there was a family that just wouldn't give up on their loved one who was practically brain dead. They expressed their unhappiness to the ICU physicians. Our attending in palliative was able to calm things a bit, making sure everyone was heard and coming up with a plan. I followed up. I talked to the family about their loved one, about the person's life, looking at photos, and having them tell some stories, which brought a little bit of laughter to the room. Then we said a prayer, and the mood was much better. This doesn't always happen, but it happens often enough for me to say that you can call chaplains when there is family strife and anger, when you are shocked and saddened by a situation. This is the chaplain's best friend. Something a chaplain should always have on hand: tissues. Carry some or know where you can get them. Once in a while, I would receive a referral to see a patient who wasn't dying necessarily, but who was overwhelmed and scared and tearful. What's more, the doctor was feeling a little bit of that as well. The doctor called for support for their patient, and knowing I was involved reassured them to some extent. This tended to happen with patients who were very young. I well remember the teenager who had been a boxer. She loved boxing, and she was great at it. She was in excellent shape, but she started feeling achy and feverish, and it wouldn't go away. She was only a few years younger than the resident physicians taking care of her. One of those physicians eventually had to tell this young woman she had an autoimmune disease called lupus. I have some personal experience with a family member who had lupus, and I know it's not well known, it's scary, and it can be controlled with medication. But if it is not controlled, it can be very serious. Quite possibly the young patient's boxing career was over. So my intervention mostly consisted of listening to the patient and talking about boxing and her other hopes and dreams for the future, and helping to dry her tears. And I sat with the resident as she talked to her patient. There are other patients like this, and they really stick in your memory. You can't forget them. There was a young man who was a very good guitarist. I believe he was in his early 20s. He played guitar in his church group during their services. He showed me a video of him playing. It was one of those mega churches, and they were on stage with lots of sophisticated lighting. It was almost like a rock concert. He was a sweet young man with a ready smile and a hopeful, positive outlook and great religious faith. He developed leukemia. The treatment caused him to have paralysis in his left hand. This, of course, made it impossible to play guitar again, at least not to the same level of proficiency as before. This was a huge loss for him, and he was experiencing pronounced grief. He tried several experimental medicines that his hematologist secured for him. He even traveled across the country for one of these clinical trials. He fought for at least a year. Eventually, he was referred to hospice. I remember going to his room and seeing the guitar in the corner. He kept practicing while he was in the hospital, trying to get his skill back again, but it wasn't meant to be. That one tugs at my heart to this day. When someone shuts down. Sometimes patients just stop responding. It all gets to be too much for them. They stop participating in their own care. They say no to everything. This is a good time to make a referral to your palliative care team. You might also consider making a referral to the chaplain. Someone like me can listen to what's behind the patient's state of mind. Oftentimes, events in the past are influencing the patient. Maybe their relatives had bad reactions to chemo or other therapies in the past, and this is on their mind now. Talking about it can help clinicians understand what's going on, and it might make the patient more receptive to talking about a plan going forward. I'll quickly mention a few more situations which I will expand on in subsequent episodes. When someone is crying, this can happen after a bad diagnosis or other bad news. No one should have to suffer alone. Sometimes people just need to have someone to talk to about their fears. When someone holds out for a miracle, this is very common, and it can prevent people from thinking about making decisions or plans about their care. Advanced directives, such as the power of attorney for health care. Terminal extubation. Chaplains can do a prayer with family. When someone asks for spiritual support. I put this in at the end because in my personal experience, it's actually pretty uncommon, not what you would expect. But people who are strongly religious and for whom God is a constant presence won't ask because they pray on their own. People who are used to being on their own don't even think to ask for spiritual support. If they do, you should obviously call the chaplain. The only other thing I'd like to add is that chaplains are waiting for you to call. We love it when doctors call and ask for support, or nurses call, or anyone. So we can slide down the firehouse pole and put out whatever fire you have going on. So take advantage of this support for your patients. This has been Dharma for Doctors, Spiritual Care for Caregivers, and I'm your host, Chaplain Greg Holden. Please subscribe, because I have lots more planned for this channel. Thanks for listening. I wish you peace.